Once again, I point out that the civil rights movement is tied directly to the Cold War. This is part and parcel of the Cold War, the domestic Cold War. When the Brown v. Board of Education decision came out, a number of Southern governors, representatives, senators, and politicians signed what was known as the Southern Manifesto, in which they expressed their opposition to the Brown v. Board of Education decision, and that they would do everything in their power to circumvent it.
And those are
the first
beautiful
test of the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. Because remember, the Supreme Court only rules. It cannot call out the Guard. It cannot call out the troops or the police or anything like that. It simply rules.
Time of agitation.
At Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, the National Guard was called out by Governor Orville Faubus to block African Americans from integrating the school.
And then the 13
At that
days.
point, President Eisenhower was faced with a very difficult decision.
Finally, Lyndon Johnson over America.
In the end, he enforces the law. And the law is that schools must be desegregated. And so, using the powers of the president as commander-in-chief, he federalizes the National Guard. And now the National Guard, instead of blocking African Americans from school, they're now blocking white protesters from keeping African Americans.
But it was not the end.
The Supreme Court then, in answer to the charges of many that the states were not bound by Supreme Court rulings, arguing states' rights and the 10th Amendment, issues the Cooper v. Aaron decision. The Cooper v. Aaron says that the states will abide by the rulings of the United States Supreme Court.
Sit-ins, such as at Greensboro in North Carolina.
In order to
at lunch counters and so forth.
Show its support for Brown, Congress now passes the Civil Rights Act of 1957, but not without some trouble. For Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, an ardent segregationist, despite the fact that he fathered children with a black mistress.
Trailways, buses.
Strom Thurmond got up and sustained the longest one-term filibuster in the history of the Senate in an attempt to keep the bill from becoming law. He went on for 24 hours and 18 minutes reading from every state's election laws in alphabetical order, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and George Washington's farewell address.
And
look at the record. No one has spoken longer.
Of course, this was not going to be simply acquiesced to by whites.
He holds.
No less a personage than Theophilus
despite his filibuster, the bill passed the House of 285 to 126, and the Republicans voted 167 to 19 in favor.
Use the police.
The Democrats were 118 to 107. The Senate passed at 72 to 18.
Break-up marches
Republicans
African Americans
were 43 to 04.
In many of these
Democrats were 29 to 18.
First Amendment in the prohibiting
President Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act into law
There were many
September 9th, 1957. What does it do? It appoints a six-member Civil Rights Commission. The founder of it prohibits intimidating, coercing, otherwising, or interfering with the rights of persons to vote for organizations members of Congress. The joke was, it also establishes a civil rights division, neither nonviolent nor center. Harry Belafonte. Remember Harry Belafonte? Did many things in the protest region, especially. On the upper right, then you have Stokely Carmichael with Brando right behind us, who passed away in 1998. You see, became known as director Joseph Mankiewicz when he adopted his son David. Stokely Carmichael lives at quintessential in your face. And next to him is Charlton Heston, who Moses made the Ten Commandments uncomfortable. Who later on would become the spokesman for the National Rifle Association from Mike Cooley. He was a honorary prime minister, number of magnificent movies, Planet of the Apes, and whereas Martin Luther King preached tolerance and nonviolence, Carmichael Heston's right as author James Powell.
altogether.
Several U.S. senators, eventually though, African Americans,
Washington,
to really bring it home, Michigan,
to
Wayne
members
Morse
of Oregon,
Congress,
white-haired
and
with
to
the glasses,
and William Proxmire
organized the
from
March on
Wisconsin.
Washington.
And finally, you had Bob Dylan and Joan Baez,
big
March on
singers
Washington.
there.
There
was
were some other
people that showed up, like
recognizing that the Civil Rights Acts existed, the folk singers, Peter Paul and Mary's fading, but this was a lot of concerts still in a position of subordination to the rest of society. It is, of course, here that Dr. Martin Luther King delivers his "I Have a Dream" speech.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, 'tis of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last."
President, you have said, and I think more than once, that heads of government should not go to the summit to negotiate agreements, but only to approve agreements negotiated at a lower level. Now it's being said and written that you're going to eat those words and go to a summit without any agreement at a lower level. Has your position changed, sir?
Well, I'm going to have a dinner for all the people who've written it, and we'll see who eats what.
I think that in hearing the talking of President Kennedy and handling the questions from the press, and this just one instance shows a markedly different White House press relationship than currently, shall we say, exists today. John F. Kennedy was the second son of Joseph Francis Kennedy. His older brother was Joseph Patrick Kennedy, Jr., and it was the older brother, Joe, who was the one who was supposed to be groomed for the higher offices, the higher things. The younger Kennedy, the second of 9 children to Rose and Joseph P. Kennedy, was something of a sickly boy. And while he was well cared for and also groomed by his father, it was expected that the older brother would be the one that would carry on the family torch. The Kennedys are an interesting family because Joseph Kennedy came from a bootlegger's Irish-American family, whereas his mother, Rose, came from a long-standing Irish political family in Boston, Rose Fitzgerald. Kennedy's maternal grandfather was John Fitzgerald. He's named after his maternal grandfather, who was the mayor of Boston, nicknamed Honey Fitz. Kennedy, when the Second World War broke out, both the older 2 Kennedy boys enlisted in the service. And the older brother, Joseph Kennedy, was shot down and killed over Europe, and the first Kennedy son to die. And so the mantle fell to young John, who was a PT boat captain in the Pacific, commander of PT 109. His ship was cut in half by a Japanese marine destroyer. He was very badly injured, suffered back problems the rest of his life. When he came home, he parlayed his wartime service into defeating the incumbent senator from Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., who was the son of the former Henry Cabot Lodge, Sr., who had been Woodrow Wilson's big staunch opponent in the election of, in the Treaty of Versailles. Kennedy went from being the Senate in Massachusetts to being a vice presidential candidate in 1956, although he did not get the nomination from his party. And then in 1960, he chose to run for the presidency against a rather strong field of Democratic candidates, including Texas Senator Lyndon B. Johnson. In the end, Kennedy won the nomination, and then he became the 35th President of the United States, at the youngest age ever for a man to be elected president, 43 years. Now remember, Theodore Roosevelt had been the youngest man to be president, to take the oath of office, at 42, but Roosevelt was not elected at 42, he'd be elected at 46. And so let's look at the myth of Camelot. John F. Kennedy, as president, served as president for less than 1,000 days. And yet, what 1,000 days it was, and because of the fact that it was a presidency that was cut short, sort of adds to the legend and adds to the myth. It was called Camelot because of the youthfulness of Kennedy and his family and the glittering aspects of the presidency, as he sought to bring sort of a fairy tale romance aspect to the presidency, taking over from the elderly and somewhat staid Eisenhower. So how did John F. Kennedy become the president? First of all, in 1960, the Republicans chose Ike's running mate and vice president, Richard Nixon, as their presidential nominee. The Democrats chose Kennedy. Kennedy and Nixon engaged in a series of televised debates, the first of which is the one that really sets the tone, because Kennedy comes off on TV looking very suave, very in control of himself. Richard Nixon, who had not had a lot of time to prepare for the debate because he had been deathly ill for several weeks prior to the debate, came across looking very sweaty, very haggard, with his usual 5 o'clock shadow. And those who watched the debates roundly agreed that Kennedy won. However, those who listened to the debates on radio said it was actually Nixon that won the debates. So that's interesting. And you see how television as a medium developed. And so this is the first advantage that Kennedy has over Nixon. Called the New Frontier. You have the Kennedy strategy. Bring in the best. He chooses his former opponent, Lyndon Johnson, said some really rough things about Kennedy in the primary battle. He chooses him as his running mate. Why? Kennedy is from Massachusetts. He went to Harvard. He represents the coastal elite sense of service. Remember what he said. Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, comes from the state of Texas. He's a Southern Democrat. Ask not already the Democratic Party is beginning to realize that Southern Democrats are beginning to kind of slip through there. That is the cornerstone of Kennedy, right politically. That's the new frontier. They're beginning to tack more and more toward the young people of America. He issues the challenge of the Peace Corps. And so, using Lyndon Johnson as his vice presidential candidate, he'll begin to hammer the GOP on civil rights to the Marshall Plan. But this time we're going into the third world. And send Americans out with the knowledge that they have acquired in college, and a sense of service. He's going to bring and so forth. American technology, American know-how, and American understanding of people of the third world. To give them better water systems, to give them better, at the end of the evening on Election Day, and so John F. Kennedy, and remember something else, that the Peace Corps is first and foremost a method of anti-communism. He is not just exporting American technology. He's exporting America. That is one of the big keys of the Peace Corps. He appoints his brother-in-law to head the Peace Corps, Sergeant Shriver. John, be a good boy now. Let me finish. Who was married to one of Kennedy's sisters. They produced a daughter named Maria, and Maria would go on and marry Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. As part of Kennedy's New Frontier, he's looking more than just at the frontier of the country and the land. He's looking beyond even the earth itself. Remember that the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in what was known as the space race. Realizing that the idea was very simple. He married a man on the moon, a bullied woman, Maria. But Kennedy says, we choose to go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. He was, there's a great deal of haggling over nuclear testing. And then in 1960, challenging America, find a new way, find newer ways to do things. Surrounds West Berlin studying with the wall. And that's where Kennedy goes to Berlin and was. When it came to foreign policy, Ich bin ein Berliner makes an adjustment to Eisenhower's Berliner with you to West Berlin. And the adjustment is simple. The people of Berlin had a joke over that because we're not going to have any more massive retaliation. We're going to develop flexible response. What is flexible response, you ask? Flexible response means that if the Soviets, you can actually have a little incursion here or do a little thing there, then we have a little incursion, we do a little response carrying from the White House. We adapt our response to the circumstance. bonds.
They will tell you
And
that from
he was going to go and hammer the Soviets in diplomacy under the capital to view. Going to make sure that the Soviets knew who the
on the left
young
you see
Turks
veiled
were
figure
in
of
this
Jacqueline
world of
Kennedy,
foreign
who was
diplomacy.
very
Well, Kennedy was going to get
overwrought
his ass
with grief,
handed
but
to him,
managed to
again,
hold it in
most
most
of
of
the
the
time.
Soviets weren't
What
too
happened?
bad.
Holding her
Yeah,
right hand
diplomacy
is her
either.
young daughter,
The picture that
Caroline
you
Kennedy,
see
that
begin
came up
and
on the
look,
right. You see
at
Kennedy
the
in the
bottom
sunglasses,
left, you see
and
her
immediately
son,
to Kennedy's
John,
right, looking up,
John
is
Kennedy,
Werner von Braun.
who
To
was now
Jackie's
rocket
left
scientist,
is Robert F. Kennedy.
came to the
And
U.S.
you
and
two
the
Soviets
Soviets
will
would
get to
confirm
his
him.
second younger
He's
brother.
one of the
Of course,
reasons
the
why
Soviets, the Attorney General of the United States,
but let's not forget,
and himself
the
defeated
Kennedy
killed
that also made it to
7
the
years
moon
later.
Khrushchev helped us
To
make
Jackie's
say,
right
on
plaque,
to
you see the
and
vintage figure of Senator Edward M. Kennedy,
So
the youngest
what's the
of the
decision
Kennedys,
here?
the youngest
Well,
brother.
if we
who
invade
was the
Cuba,
senator from
that
Massachusetts
means the
at
Soviets
time.
will come to the support.
And between
we
Jackie
gotta
and Teddy
declare
is the
war.
actor Peter
If
Lawford,
we bomb
who was
Cuba
Kennedy's
and bomb the
brother-in-law.
sites,
At the
then
bottom
we'll
right, you see the
have a
final
nuclear war.
interment of the
There was
casket
only
at
one thing that
Arlington
could be
National
done. The
Cemetery
U.S. is going to
as
quarantine
the
Cuba rather than
members
blockade
from
it. They
all
say
the
quarantine,
services
because you got all these members of the Kennedy cabinet that are
hold the
going
flag.
around using
But I
nuanced
draw your
language
attention
and so
to
forth.
the soldiers in the green and khaki in tight formation
Eventually,
with their arms
on
extended.
October the 26th,
Those soldiers are from the
Soviets
Republic
made the
of
decision to
Ireland.
withdraw the missiles.
And
from
in
Cuba,
March of that year,
with the
Kennedy
understanding
and Jackie
that the
had gone
communist
to
revolution
Ireland to
in
visit
Cuba would
Kennedy's
stay in place,
ancestral home
which is
and
why the missiles
lay
were there in
wreaths
the
at the
first
grave
place.
of Commodore
But the
John
US
Barry
would
and
not
so
take
forth.
any
And
overt
Kennedy
or even
addressed
covert measures
the
to
Irish
try
Parliament
and
where he
overthrow
said, if it
Castro.
hadn't been for happenstance of birth, I probably would be
agreement was
sitting
reached.
with you all today instead of as president.
But because they were going through diplomatic
the Irish
channels
people
and back
loved
channels,
him.
and
They
that
turned
took a
out he
long
was
time,
so
and
popular
maybe
there.
could
He
start a
told them
nuclear
all to
war,
make sure they
even
came
though a
out to
peace
American
agreement had been
registered to
settled.
vote.
They established
It was
a
a
direct link between the
magnificent
Kremlin
trip, and he said, "I'll be
Washington."
back next spring."
U.S.
Which,
Soviet
of course, he never
hotline,
was. But in
where
the
the
process of
President
the
of the United States can
visit,
pick up the
Jackie
phone
saw the
and talk
Irish soldiers
directly
and
to
how
the Soviet
well
General
disciplined they were in their drill, and she
And
demanded
so,
that they come and be at the
as
grave
many
site
people
for
say,
the funeral.
the eagle stared
And so
down
they
the
flew
bear,
these young men
and the bear
in
blinked
the night
first.
before the funeral.
But in truth,
put them at Fort Lee, Virginia,
there's another part
and
to
brought
this,
them
and
to
that
the
is
graveside. They
Soviets
didn't get to see
managed
any
to
of the
maintain
funeral
the
themselves.
Cuban Revolution.
They simply were
Of
at
course, the Americans were
graveside,
using the
and then
Monroe
they put
Doctrine as their justification.
casket in the ground while the
colonial
Irish
incursion
troops
by the
were
Soviets.
doing
Well,
their drill.
That's
After it
the
was
Navy
over
or
with, the
Cold
Irish troops
Wars,
were
the
back
Cuban
on the
Missile
plane
Crisis.
heading
From this
home.
point onward, you
And
start
Kennedy,
to
of
see
course, was laid to
a
rest in
warming of
Arlington, as I
relations, a
said,
long,
and the
slow
eternal
warming.
flame
Eventually, we'll get
was
to
lit.
détente in the 1970s. But the U.S. and the Soviets now begin to talk and use diplomacy more. There's a limited test ban treaty signed to end testing in the atmosphere. It all has to be underground. The U.S. also establishes Strategic Air Command, SAC, which you keep B-52 bombers in the air all the time. So for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there are B-52 bombers.
The man who,
as I
up
said,
there,
Lyndon
John
Johnson
F.
is a
Kennedy,
very
making
complex
sure
man.
walked off the plane, asked
He's
the
very
American
courageous,
people to
and
pray
incredibly
for
courageous,
the
and
family
politically
of the
courageous,
unlike
And
what
by
we're
the
seeing
way,
right now in the
different
United
from
States
John F.
Senate.
Kennedy,
He was a
you
guy
could
who
possibly have
stood by
imagined.
his convictions
Lyndon
to the
Baines
end,
Johnson
and
did
in
not
many
come
ways
from a
backed up
wealthy
what he
northeastern
preached.
family.
Not in all
No,
ways,
he
but in
came
many
from
ways.
the
His
Texas
real
backcountry,
significance
place
of
of
great
great
is
poverty.
the Civil Rights
He
Act
didn't go to
of
Harvard.
1964,
He went to the
and then
Texas
the Voting
State
Rights Act
Teachers
of
College.
1965.
Like Kennedy, he did go into the
ends
Navy,
voter
but as a
discrimination
congressman
and mandated
from
the
Washington, he was not
desegregation of schools,
allowed to serve.
workplaces,
Nonetheless,
and
he
public
tried to get
places.
out into the Pacific.
He does this
and traveled
knowing
out
full
there
well that he
until
may
President
lose
Roosevelt heard
Democratic
about it and
support in
ordered
the
him
South.
back right
And
away.
all the Democrats that are in the South are going
As
to buck
a
him
Democrat
and turn away
in,
from him, and he knows that.
the
He
days
says,
of
"I'm going to
Roosevelt,
probably lose the
he
whole
became
South
an
because of
ardent
this."
New Dealer.
In fact, he was
Johnson's
he
signature
believed himself
program
to
that
be,
he
in
wants
many
to
ways,
be
the
his
inheritor
legacy,
of the
whereas
New Deal.
Kennedy had the
And
New
he was going to
Frontier.
create a new
Johnson
program
wants
to
the Great
take
Society.
the New Deal
Notice
to the
I have
next
that in
level.
nice big print.
He had an
The Great
interesting
Society
style,
is going to be
Johnson's
Johnson's
called the Johnson treatment,
extension
where he got
of the
into
New
your
Deal.
personal
His
space.
continuation
He
of the New
leaned
Deal.
into you. Nose
It's going
to
to be a
nose. war on
talking
poverty.
to you in a very congenial
Felt that
Texas
it was
way.
absolutely
You could tell that there was
wrong
a hint of
at
brutality
places
right
like
underneath
where he
there.
grew up and other
Whereas
places
Kennedy
in
was
America
suave and
were
debonair, Johnson was
places of
coarse.
abject poverty.
How coarse was he? Well, he
gonna
was
bring
noted for
poverty
some
to
of
an
his
end.
very coarse
The Great
statements.
Society was about
For instance,
education,
when asked
about
why
job
he did not
training,
fire
about
J. Edgar
community
Hoover,
development.
he once remarked, "Well,
This
I'd rather
was
have
going
him
to
inside the
cost
tent
money.
pissing out And so it would be massive
inside the
spending by
tent
federal
pissing out,
government
and outside the
and
tent
tax
pissing in. I
increases.
almost messed that
And
up.
this, of course, makes
And
Republicans say
he would
"Oh,
often take
no,
his
no." Staff and secretaries.
Johnson has a
males
great
into
deal
the
of
men's room
opposition
with him when he had
from
to
what is known
have
as
a
the
bowel
New
movement
Right.
and
Remember
conduct
that
a
the
meeting
right
from
wing
the
had
start.
kind of gone into
Yeah.
a little bit of a
And
hiding.
and this is all on the White House tapes, by the way.
The 50s,
some of the
because of
recorded
what happened with
conversations,
McCarthy.
no less dominating.
Well, now
figure
it
that
gets
he had
a
in
new
1960s.
apostle in the form of William F.
He's
Buckley
a
Jr.
complex man
He
when
talked
Jones.
like this.
Earl,
His
he is
what's called the transatlantic
very
accent.
Earl Warren.
And Buckley is the intellectual
Republican
force.
At the same time, he could be very brutal.
And then you have Barry Goldwater,
conservative, even to members of his own
who was the
cabinet.
Republican candidate in
Bobby Kennedy,
1964.
remember, once you get to
who
the
goes around
Supreme
saying
Court,
extremism in the
you
defense
no
of
longer have
liberty
to
is
run
no
for
vice.
office. You no longer
He
have to
was a
pander
civil
to a
rights
voting base.
believer,
You can
but he
do what your
opposes the
conscience
Civil Rights
dictates
Act
to
of
you. And Earl
1964
Warren had a
because he
conscience.
believes that it is against
And
the
oftentimes Eisenhower said
separation
that
of
was the
powers
biggest regret of my
and
life,
the
appointing him
federalism
to
and
the
not what the
Supreme
government
Court.
should be doing.
As governor of
Even though
California,
he himself was
he
personally
was,
in favor of
um,
civil rights.
right wing.
He was also
but not
very
overly
hawkish
right wing, and
in that he
was an
advocated